Welcome to Chapter 12, Part 2, where we're talking about trade blockages, for want of a better word. Okay, trade embargoes. That probably is the best way to describe it. This is trade discrimination and basically a nation or group of nations, often coordinated through the United Nations, incidentally, can keep ordinary trade barriers on its trade with most countries, but insist on making trade with a particular country or countries difficult or impossible. So probably you're thinking, give us an example of a country. Well, North Korea would be a good example, as would be Iran. And the examples used here are for Iran. And Cuba is also another example, and more recently, Venezuela is a further example. So, to wage economic warfare, nations have often imposed economic sanctions or embargoes, which are discriminatory restrictions or bans on economic exchange. Here we see the effect of this, and notice in the diagram, let's start off with B on the right hand side. This is the total exports to a particular country. That's SN plus SE. Now, SN plus SE consists of two different components. It's the supply from non-embargoed countries plus the supply from embargoing countries. So in other words, it's the supply that comes without any trade embargo. And you can see it's an upward sloping supply curve to Iran. And you can see import demand is there as well. Downward sloping demand curve labeled D subscript M. So the equilibrium would be F. In other words, Iran would import Q0 of the product, whatever it is, and at price P0. So now the embargo goes into place. Well, what actually happens? Well, now we have to take out the embargoing supply because none of that embargoing supply, officially anyway, can get through. So that kind of sets the supply curve to SN, which is the export supply to Iran from non-embargoing countries. What's the effect of that? Well, the blue arrow gives it all away. We move from point F to point E. So this is a price of P1, and obviously at a quantity of less than Q0. What's happened here? Well, clearly consumer surplus for the country concerned has gone down by B plus C, but also the producer surplus A from those embargoing countries has also gone. It's disappeared. It's been lost. So in the embargoing countries, another way of looking at it is that the domestic supply now has been shut off completely to those embargoing countries, and you can see that in the left-hand diagram, and therefore that area A is also lost. Now, when you evaluate the trade embargo, obviously the trade embargo is placed not for economic reasons, but for other reasons, and usually it's political reasons. It might be, in the case of Iran, to stop them developing a nuclear weapon. In the case of Cuba, it might be as opposition to the communist regime there, with the hope that embargoing them will cause a regime change. Similarly, in Venezuela, the embargo that we have on Venezuela means that we're hoping for regime change in that country, as we do with North Korea as well. So it occurs when the target country's national decision makers have so much at stake in the policy that provoked the embargo that they will stick with that policy even if the economic cost of the nation becomes extreme. And probably the best example of that would be North Korea, where President Trump went to meet with Kim Jong-un, Il was his father, Kim Jong-un, who's the current leader of North Korea, and basically showed him videos of how North Korea would be if they gave up nuclear weapons. But the Kim family has always had those nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip, and they don't want to give away that bargaining chip without substantial, things given by the U.S. administration. So that political stubbornness is more likely if the target country is a dictatorship, which, all the countries I mentioned virtually are now dictatorships. Even Venezuela is considered a dictatorship now. And the dictatorship would be jeopardized by retreating from the policy that provoked the embargo. Kim Jong-un is very afraid that if he gives up nuclear weapons, then their country will be subject to invasion. So they feel that having nuclear weapons is the one way of safeguarding the regime. In such a case, the dictatorship is going to refuse to budge, even if the economic costs mount up. And the trouble with an embargo, and most embargoes, in fact, is they usually don't have a very big effect, particularly if the country concerned actually can sidestep the embargo. So with North Korea, we've found, for example, that North Korea has been importing these products, which some of them are only made in the US, for example, but importing them via third countries. So the US will export to that third country, and then that country will just pass it on to North Korea. Embargoes and other economic sanctions apply stronger pressure when the embargoing country or countries have high elasticities and the target countries have low ones. That's just the nature of these diagrams. So the embargoing country has high elasticity, meaning relatively flat supply and demand curve, and the target countries have low ones. So low elasticities means steep demand curves. When is this likely to be true? Well, here we can see an embargo that backfires. So on the left, we've got an embargo that backfires. In other words, here we have the same diagram as before. So the initial equilibrium is at P0 and F. But notice when we take out the embargoing supply, what we're left with is P1, which is hardly anything above P0. It's a very small amount above P0. So B and C is the consumer surplus lost in the country. So that's not likely to change the regime at all. And A is lost by the embargoing countries from their supply. So that means that the producers from the embargoing countries really lose out. On the right-hand side, there's the same, somewhat different, actually, example. It's a virtually irrelevant embargo. In other words, in the one on the left, the embargo is backfired because the embargoing country has hurt itself much more than it's hurt the embargoed country. The one on the right shows that just all the areas are pifflingly small. So in other words, what happens here is the price goes up, sure, the quantity goes down for the importing country, but the loss of consumer surplus is minute, and the loss of producer surplus to the embargoing country is minute. So it really doesn't make much difference, the embargo in this case at all. So when is a trade embargo more likely to work? The actual experience is that big countries tend to pick on small ones. Embargoes have more chance of success if they are sudden and comprehensive when first imposed. And third, embargoes have more chance of changing a target government's policies when the citizens hurt by the embargo can apply the political pressure on the heads of state as in a democracy. So if the embargo causes mass demonstrations, the embargoing countries will probably think that that's a successful embargo and therefore should continue with the embargo. Thank you for listening, and that's the end of the second part to the chapter.